Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to another little session in the Issues and Debates module, and we're going to be focusing on nomothetic and idiographic approaches. Remember, this makes up part of the Issues and Debates module in paper 3. Now, there's nothing fancy here on this one regarding the spec link, so let's just bring that up. It says idiographic and nomothetic approaches to psychological investigation. So it's how the key thing here is psychological investigation, how the approaches, how do they tackle on how they get their data and their research. But remember in this one, just a bit of a big hint, there's no strengths and limitations. We look at arguments in favour and arguments against using the nomothetic approach and the idiographic approach as well. But let's start with the nomothetic approach. It's always a good place to start somewhere, isn't it? Now, one of the key aims of science is to be able to predict future events based on the way that reactions have occurred in the past. And one of the ways to do this is to create general laws, then it can explain how similar events will occur in the future. This debate is concerned, the debate being the nomothetic debate, with whether psychologists should adopt a particular aim and try to create these general laws or rules to be able to explain human behavior so that we can predict future behavior and potentially control, right? Because we've got these general laws and that we can make these predictions saying this is what could happen and potentially control it or at least accommodate it in some way. So by creating these general laws based on the scientific evidence, we can then understand saying, well, in this situation, a person could respond this way. And if it's a negative response, we could then perhaps put things in place to prevent that negative behavior or interaction that could occur. Now, I said just a moment ago, it follows the scientific methods of investigation. Now, experimentation is the best way to develop these scientific laws. Using experiments, you can observe aspects of behavior and actually develop principles that apply to all forms of behavior in similar circumstances. For example, the cognitive psychology that we just did in memory has got plenty of examples of a nomothetic approach. Now, it's not just the cognitive approach. You will see in the biological and the behaviors. Think about the behaviorist approach. We've got Pavlov's classical conditioning, and we've got Skinner's operant conditioning. These are nomothetic laws that highlight how people learn. Classical conditioning, it's a neutral stimulus paired, so associated with a non-conditioned stimulus and a non-conditioned response. So it's creating these nomothetic or these general rules or laws and how a person will learn. And the same applies, for example, in the module memory that we recently completed. For example, Godin and Badley, they did a study of divers, showed that recall was 40% lower when the conditions in or out of the water at learning and recall didn't match. So they created this clear nomothetic approach to understanding how we can recall information more accurately or what prevents us recalling that information. The same way with Carter and Cassidy, they used the antihistamine drugs, given at times affected the recall, right? Whether they took the drug and they learned the words and recalled it without the drug. So here we have got plenty of examples in a lot of our modules. And that's the nice thing about the issues and debates modules, that you can bring in evidence from the other modules. So you're not learning new research here. We can use information that we've learned from other modules. For example, we just spoke about from the approaches operating in classical conditioning. We've just looked at cognitive approach, and we've just looked at 2 pieces of research there. So the nomothetic approach is very much creating these general laws that we can apply to all to explain why a person's behaving that way or predict how they are going to. So here it's about generalization to everybody. It's not looking at the individual, it's looking at all people and how we can make these general laws to explain human behavior. So let's just look at just a couple of an argument in favor and against, but I've just realized I've got another point there. So let's have a look at this one. The nomothetic approach very much favors psychological approaches that are deterministic and reductionist, because those are the ones that favor the scientific method of investigation, because we know determinism and reductionism are very much of the scientific method, the scientific approach. We've got biological determinism, we've got environmental determinism, the same with reductionism, we've got soft and hard determinism. So these are the approaches, biological, behaviors, cognitive, that will use this approach. Now we can move on. So let's just look at an argument in favor and an argument against the nomothetic approach. So we'll start off with an argument in favor of using the nomothetic approach. And the argument in favor of using it, it is more scientific than the idiographic approach. Now you might say, well, why is it more scientific? Well, actually, it's all the processes that are involved in the nomothetic research. They tend to be more scientific. They are testing under standardized conditions. They have high levels of control because the preferred method of investigation is most probably the laboratory experiment. So standardization, it's about generating a lot of quantitative data and then allows us to do statistical analysis, right, allows us to do statistical analysis. So therefore we can see whether we found significance or not. So these processes help and enable psychologists to establish the norm of typical behavior, and they have, for example, the data to back it up. So therefore it will have more scientific credibility compared to that of the idiographic approach. Because remember, part of the scientific approach is being able to replicate, to get reliable data, to increase the validity. So using the laboratory experiments and the scientific approach allows this to happen. Now, on the downside, an argument against the nomothetic approach, actually, it's so concerned on this concept of it being representative and being able to generalize to the general population or the target populations, that actually it loses the individual. The person themselves no longer seems to be of concern. Because it's so much about creating these general laws, predictions, it doesn't account for individual differences. Why something might not apply to an individual. For example, and you've got an example in the book about schizophrenia, knowing that actually there is 1% of the general population that will develop schizophrenia. So if we only have 1% of the general population, which is a very, very small amount of the general population, do we actually have these general laws that we can apply? Because they might be based on the uniqueness of that individual, and actually tells us, this nomothetic approach tells us very little. It creates these general laws about schizophrenia, but it doesn't tell us actually what the person's experiencing, and perhaps what they're experiencing could be quite different to what somebody else has experienced. The humanistic approach would agree with that point, because it needs to put the person at center. That the humanistic approach would argue against the nomothetic approach, because it's about putting the person at the center. To understand a person's behavior, we need to understand all aspects of their life, rather than saying, well, everyone behaves this way, so that's why they're behaving, and it might not be applicable. So here we've got two nice arguments in favor and arguments against the nomothetic approach. So let's have a quick look at the idiographic approach. Now, the idiographic approach, on the other hand, it's about this idea that it attempts to describe the nature of the individual, that each person is unique. They have their own individual subjective experiences. They've got different motivations, different values. They interpret the world due to their subjectivity. And so therefore, the idiographic approach actually says it's not possible to understand the individual. It's not possible to create these general laws to apply to everybody. So therefore, the idiographic approach isn't looking at the individual as a collective unit, so all clumped together, but as an individual. This approach would suggest that we should recognize the uniqueness of all individuals and focus specifically on them, rather than trying to create these general laws. And therefore, it focuses very different. I mean, if we're looking at similarities and differences between these approaches, nomothetic is very much quantitative, where idiographic is very much about understanding and producing the qualitative data. So understanding why this happens and why that person is feeling that way. And that is the logic behind the idiographic approach. It's about, to understand human behavior, we need to understand it from the individual. Now, the clear method of investigation for the idiographic approach is things like case studies, unstructured interviews, other open self-reported measures, perhaps flexible longitudinal studies, so that we can gather a lot of information about that particular individual, so that we can understand the collective data that surrounds them, information, so that we can understand their unique experience. So therefore, it's quite different to the nomothetic approach. Now, with the idiographic approach, in the sense when it comes to doing research, it's predominantly built on things like case studies that will use other methods of investigation. And we can see that, well, actually, the humanistic approach actually says we shouldn't be studying people like objects. So therefore, we don't actually have much information or much qualitative data to support them. But we have the psychodynamic approach, very much uses the case study approach. Now, please note here, the psychodynamic approach does use case studies, because we've got things like Anna O and Little Hunts. So therefore, its ways to investigate is very much idiographic. So we must remember that. So therefore, it's really important to understand that these two approaches are quite different to each other. So like I said, case studies have been used throughout psychological research, and therefore allows us to get more understanding. Now, we can actually say idiographic and nomothetic can go hand in hand. For example, if we look at memory, the module of memory, we've got the case study of HM, Clive Wearing. And those case studies has given us unique information that allows us then to develop these nomothetic approach. So they can actually work together. But there's lots of examples of this idiographic approach. Let's look at Freud, and he did the psychosexual stages of development. And actually, this is where for the psychodynamic approach, it can be a little confusing because it has an idiographic way of investigating. So it uses case studies to create the nomothetic laws. Because we've got the psychosexual stages of development, but if you look in the phallic stage, and this is where the Oedipus and the Electra complex done, that was based on the Oedipus complex on the case study of Little Hans. So his methods of investigation, Freud, is very idiographic in this sense. So it's really important that when we look at methods of investigation, behaviorist, very much nomothetic, because it creates general laws, like I said earlier, classical and operant conditioning, idiographic approach to investigation, psychodynamic approach is very much idiographic in its form of investigation. However, it does create nomothetic laws based on that idiographic ways of investigation. So don't get confused with those. But now let's move on and have a look at two arguments, one in favor and one against the idiographic approach. So let's start with one that follows a qualitative account of the individual, providing insightful and important information that may complement the nomothetic approach. Now, this links back to what I just said previously. A strength of the idiographic approach is that it does give us an in-depth account of that individual's behavior. And that may lead then to further to see whether this happens in other people, which will then can lead to creating nomothetic laws. But it has its starting point that the individual is utmost important in that. That's what it says. It creates this qualitative, so it gives psychological researchers a lot of insightful information that could lead to developing general laws, because then you can see whether it exists in that of the general population, and then they therefore complement the nomothetic approach. So that is a nice strength, or I'm using the wrong word, sorry, a clear argument in favor of using this idiographic approach, because it allows us to get a lot of information. There is a nice example in your textbook. A single case may generate a hypothesis for further study. For example, the case study of HM in Clive Wearing. It started off as a single case, but then they've used that as the basis to understand that there is differences in the way that we process information in the short-term and long-term memory, that they are definitely short and long-term memory stores. So that started off as a basis to help further support these nomothetic laws that we have. Now, an issue with the idiographic approach is that it can be seen as very restrictive due to its method of investigation. It's predominantly case studies, because what we're doing, idiographic, it may use a whole collection of qualitative methods like unstructured interviews and things like that, and it will create this case study of that one individual or that one particular thing. And that is restrictive in this sense, because it's based on the uniqueness of that person, and therefore it has limited generalizability. Can we actually take the information, for example, from Clive Wearing or HM and actually apply it to everybody's long-term and short-term memory? Can we see that is an issue, and that could be an argument against using this idiographic approach. Also, let's look at, for example, the Oedipus complex. It was based on one case study of Little Hans. Can we then apply it to all little boys? So here we can clearly see that the ideographic approach can be very restrictive due to its ability to generalize beyond that one individual. So this approach is actually, it creates a nice debate. We can actually say that nomothetic or ideographic, but actually, like I said earlier, they can complement each other. That we may start off with an ideographic view to understand that particular behavior, and then work towards creating those nomothetic laws, because we have a good starting point from this ideographic perspective. Now, one quick little exam question, multiple choice. Which of the following statement best describes a nomothetic approach? Shade one box only. So nice exam question. Throughout your exams, you are going to have a couple of, I can't say exactly what module they're going to be in, but remember when you're answering them in the exam, it's just shading in the little oval. So have a look at the options, pause. What answer do you think it is? And unpause yourself. So pause now. Great. I'm glad you paused. I really hope you have paused, because this will just help you. So let's look at the options. A study single cases and do not formulate general laws. A study group of people and do not formulate general laws. A study groups of people and formulate general laws. A study a single cases and formulate general laws. Now we know the nomothetic. It's about applying to everybody, and it's about creating these general laws that we can apply. And yes, your answer should be C. So well done there, everybody. Please, these type of questions are, I like to refer to them as free questions, F-R-E-E, because the answer is right in front of you. So exam hint, take the time to read what's in front of you. It won't take you a minute to answer this question. Remember, we work on a minute a mark. It won't take you a minute to answer this, but take the time to read each option. Don't just kind of think, oh, I think that's the one. Read them all first, then think about what's your right option. Okay, and one last little thing. Which approach would be regarded as nomothetic or ideographic? Well, let's look at each approach. You can pause here now and write down each approach. Now, I've been discussing them throughout. So which approach would you regard as being nomothetic, and which approach would you regard, or approaches, should put that there, as ideographic? So just pause and have a quick write. See if you can remember what we've gone through. Great stuff. I'm glad you have paused. So let's have a quick. Let's start with behaviorist. Behaviorist would be very much nomothetic, because they believe human and non-human animals all learn in the same way, all behave because of the same explanations. So yep, that would be nomothetic. Cognitive approach, yes, very rarely it does use the case study, so it will sometimes rely on the ideographic, but predominantly it's got the general laws and theories. Multi-store model of memory, working memory model, it's got retrieval failure, all those theories to explain human behavior. So it would be nomothetic. Biological approach would be very much nomothetic as well, because of the scientific method of investigation it uses, the research it's compiled. It uses medical technology like fMRI scans to get the objective data, so it can create these general laws. Humanistic approach, yep, you've got it. It is 100% ideographic, because it says it puts the person at the center. Each person is unique. Yes, you have got it there. Psychodynamic one. This is the tricky one. It's way the psychodynamics methods of investigation, predominantly the case study, is very much ideographic. However, from that ideographic evidence, it creates nomothetic laws. It creates theories that can explain human behavior. We've got the theory of personality, the id, ego, and superego. We've got the psychosexual stages of development. So those are nomothetic laws, but its methods of investigation is that of an ideographic approach. Right, my lovelies. I hope this has helped you a little bit. Remember to take some time, use your textbook, add to your notes, take some time to work through and be able to explain why each approach would have this either nomothetic or ideographic approach to its psychological investigation. Really important that you can explain that. And remember, big exam hint here, this module itself, but this section, like all the other ones, you can bring in examples from other modules to back up what you're saying. Right, remember, my lovelies, if you do have any questions, send me an email and I'll get back to you. Take care and stay safe.